who will welcome us.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. This is our third Schindler Talk of 2024, and we're glad you were able to join us. I am an architect and a volunteer with the Friends of the Schindler House, and I got involved because Leslie Thomas, our board member who is in charge of runs the development committee, asked me a couple years ago. We're friends from Chicago, actually. And so I have been working to help raise awareness and funds to restore and preserve the Schindler House. I first visited the Schindler House. It was one of the first pieces of architecture that left an impact on me my first year of architecture school at University of Pennsylvania. And I since found myself organizing the Schindler Talks, and we created these two really to bring people together on all sorts of topics, including preservation, architecture, art, design, social issues, and whatever inspires us in the spirit of Rudolph and Pauline Schindler, who had held many salons at the Kings Road House. And I've learned a lot by organizing these and reconnected with some people and met a lot of new people who share similar interests, and we'll meet some of these people tonight. Just briefly, our next Schindler Talk is going to be specifically about the CMP, or Conservation Master Plan for the Schindler House restoration, and we plan on doing that in July, but we don't have an exact date yet. So just keep in touch, look at our website, look at our Instagram, social media, and we'll be sending emails out when we have more specifics. The CMP has been made possible by major funding support by the Mack Center for Art and Architecture in LA at the Schindler House and other generous donors. We hope you enjoy this discussion tonight, and we hope you'll also consider helping us to preserve and restore this house. We know a lot of you have already done so, and we really are appreciative of your generosity. Our conversation tonight is going to be, it is called How to Save Your Favorite Building, Reconciling Change with Continuity. And in a moment, I'll introduce Greg Maxwell, who's going to be our moderator for this evening. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We have 4 panelists who you'll meet in a minute. They're each going to present some of their preservation work, and we will have a Q&A after the presentation. There will be a discussion and then presentation of questions. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'm going to monitor those, and Greg is going to monitor them as well. And we'll get your questions out there. Please stay around for the questions because they're always thought-provoking. So Greg Maxwell is a licensed architect with 7 years of experience in architecture and preservation. He received his Bachelor of Architecture degree in 2015 from the New Jersey Institute of Technology and did studies in Barcelona, Rome, and Siena, Italy. He received his Master of Science in Historic Preservation with honors in 2021 from the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. His concentration in preservation design was supplemented with additional academic work as a research fellow at the Center for Architectural Conservation, and he gained experience working at Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin and several National Park Service sites, including Fort Union National Monument, Pecos National Historic Park, Tiszaga National Monument, and others. Some of his graduate research work was presented at an annual conference for the American Institute for Conservation in May of 2022, and he was named the John G. Thorpe Fellow in 2022 by the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy. He's a member of the AIA and CARB and a member of the Association for Preservation Technology, Docomomo US Chicago, and currently a board member of the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy. And he works in Chicago with Harboe Architects. Greg, I'll let you take it from here. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Anne. I hope everyone's having a nice evening. And I'm going to start with just introducing our panelists for this talk, and we'll dive right into that. So Colleen Chapin joined BCA in 2017 with over a decade of experience in historic preservation, working at the region's oldest and largest nonprofit preservation organization, Historic New England. She has expertise in complex project management, property management, and hands-on preservation implementation. At Historic New England, Colleen was responsible for the preservation, maintenance, and capital improvements of 18 properties, ranging in construction dates from the 17th to the 20th centuries. At BCA, Colleen brings a strong understanding of building science, social and architectural history of the East Coast, and modern technology to lead historic research, building condition evaluations, treatment recommendations, and project management. She's worked on a wide variety of building assessment and planning projects across a wide range of building periods from the 17th century through the 20th century. Colleen has participated on the teams that developed cultural management plans under the Getty's Keeping It Modern program for the Walter Gropius House and Boston City Hall. This work has led to a greater appreciation for modern architecture and the material and social challenges often associated with these buildings. David Fixler is principal of David Fixler Architecture Planning Preservation, and he is a lecturer in architecture, urban planning, and design at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He's an internationally recognized leader in the conservation of historic buildings and sites with a focus on structures of the mid-20th century. His projects include buildings designed by modern masters, including Alvar Aalto, Louis Kahn, Le Corbusier, and Eero Saarinen. He has authored several conservation management plans for modern buildings. David co-founded Docomomo US New England and the Association for Preservation Technology Technical Committee on Modern Heritage, and he serves as a design excellence peer review architect for the United States General Services Administration and Harvard University. He has had his design and written work published internationally in trade and scholarly books and journals, and has lectured extensively around the world. Peyton Hall is the principal architect emeritus at Historic Resources Group in Pasadena, California, and an adjunct professor in the Heritage Conservation Program at the University of Southern California. He has a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Virginia and a Master of Environmental Design from Yale University. Postgraduate studies include a certificate from the Center for Palladian Studies in Vicenza, Italy, and an NEA Research Fellowship at the National Cultural Properties Institute in Tokyo, Japan. Peyton is Chair Emeritus of the Advisors to the AIA's Historic Resources Committee, a former trustee of US ICOMOS, now World Heritage USA, and a former president of the California Preservation Foundation. He received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the California Preservation Foundation in 2021. His completed work includes historic structure reports for the Gamble House, Doris Duke's Shangri-La, and Frank Lloyd Wright's Freeman and Ennis houses, and a recent conservation assessment for Drayton Hall. He has completed projects at Angels Flight Funicular Railway, the Rose Bowl Stadium, Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, the Annenberg Community Beach House, Marion Davies Guest House, the Wallace Annenberg Center for Performing Arts, the Beverly Hills Post Office, and Grauman's Egyptian and Chinese theaters. Gunny Harboe is an internationally recognized architect dedicated to the conservation of the world's cultural heritage. Gunny has over 35 years of experience and runs his own Chicago-based firm with a focus on preservation and sustainable design. He has worked on many iconic modern masterpieces, including numerous works by Mies van der Rohe, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Louis Sullivan. His work has been recognized with dozens of national and local awards, and he has received numerous and other honors, including being named a 2001 Young Architect by the National AIA and Chicagoan of the Year by Chicago Magazine in 2010, as well as Excellence in Heritage Conservation in 2015 by the Society of Architectural Historians. Among his many professional activities, Gunny was a founding member and is a current board member of Docomomo US, and a founding member and past president of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on 20th Century Heritage, ISC 20C. He is also a past board member of the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, the AIA National Board, and Landmarks Illinois. Gunny is also an adjunct professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology and is NCARB certified and licensed in 9 states and the District of Columbia. So that's our panel for tonight. And I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the agenda for the rest of the presentation today. We're going to go through a series of case studies. Each panelist is going to present their work, their issues they've been working on. And then we're going to go through that. And then afterwards, we're going to have a brief discussion between us, and then we'll open it up for question and answer towards the end. So let's move right along. Colleen, you're up first.
All right, I need the first slide. All right. So good evening. I want to first start by thanking the organizers for pulling together this esteemed group to talk about preservation in a changing world. A big chunk of my preservation career has involved working in and around house museums. I started as a preservation carpenter, hands-on, fixing the buildings. And then I was fortunate to spend a considerable amount of time with Historic New England, where I was directly responsible for the preservation, maintenance, and capital improvements of about 18 to 20 of their historic house museums throughout Southern New England. Today, as a consultant, my time is spent evaluating various buildings, many of which are house museums, and making recommendations for treatments and upgrades. So when we're talking about reconciling change with continuity, it's really something I'm routinely trying to balance. Next, please. So one of the places I've had the privilege of working with is the Gropius House in Lincoln, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. This was Walter Gropius's personal home that he designed and lived in with his family from 1938 until he died. In the early 1980s, it became a museum in Historic New England's portfolio. House museums like Gropius House matter because they add historic and cultural and aesthetic and scenic value to a community. They reflect that this place matters. The museums provide anchors in place and time. They're necessary landmarks, although not every house can or should become a museum. But when people feel like their community matters, they're more likely to invest in preserving other aspects of character and cultural connective tissue. So making a house museum is a really important and influential act of preservation. Next, please. As a museum, Gropius House tells many stories. Obviously, there is the story of Gropius himself, father of the Bauhaus. There is the story of merging elements of traditional New England architecture with his modern designs and his use of the house as a hands-on tool for his students at Harvard. There's a story of an immigrant family and the maid that cared for them. There's the benefactor, Helen Starrow, who provided the land so he could build his house. There are stories of indigenous tribes and colonial settlers and farmers whose use of the land long predates Gropius. So preserving the house as a public museum allows people to experience these stories in a more authentic way than kind of a simple plaque or description in a book will ever provide. At the same time, understanding this complex history informs decisions about how the house is preserved. Next, please. So converting what was built as a modest-sized family home into a house museum with a steady stream of visitors requires changes. You need parking, you need a visitor center, bathrooms, universal access, safety, security measures, all those things that you probably weren't really using in a typical residential experience. So at the Gropius House, it's too small and too significant to carve out a visitor center within the house. And the landscape setting is a really important feature that cannot easily support a new building. So the solution here is use the existing garage over there on the left, turn it into a visitor center. It's literally a box within a box. You close the doors and it looks like Gropius never left this place. There's his garage, there's his house, and now you get a good context of what it was like to live there. Now, preserving Gropius as a museum requires regular decisions from micro to macro level about how to accommodate the public without losing the essential nature of the place. Next, please. To be honest, the traditional house museum model is still predominantly focused on placing houses in bell jars, retaining historic fabric at all costs, adhering to the strictest interpretation of replacement in kind. 20th century buildings magnify the fractures in that approach. Gropius used modern materials like cork flooring and glass block at the entry. These materials require maintenance, and they're not easily repaired, and they're not easily replaced because the replacements just aren't there anymore. The pristine white paint on the exterior, it quickly mildews in the New England climate. Gropius's design intent does not really lend itself to the nostalgic patina that often works for an 18th century farmhouse. So these challenges force institutions to really reconsider their typical preservation approach and philosophies, as well as their maintenance budgets and maintenance cycles and overall capital improvement planning. Next, please. Oh, there we go. Okay. Last one. Gropius House illustrates a lot about what works and what doesn't work when a historic house becomes a museum. House museums are nearly always challenged by lack of resources. Gropius is funded through a mix of endowment, private philanthropy, and public grants. And so are the other 37 houses in Historic New England's portfolio. So a lot of work goes into generating enough resources to meet the basic needs year over year, as well as prioritizing how those resources are allocated across the entire collection. Now, I didn't mention visitation revenue as a funding source, and there's a reason for that. House museums also collectively struggle to generate visitation and must constantly innovate to remain relevant. Even the famous Walter Gropius doesn't bring people back again and again in a way that generates significant preservation and operational support. Gropius is also an outlier in Historic New England's portfolio because it's modern. Staff who are well-trained in 18th century brick chimney repairs must learn a whole new set of technical skills to deal with the modern concrete steps at the Gropius House. And that goes for regulators as well, whether it's funders, the local Historic District Commission, or even the National Park Service. The historic preservation field is still very much in learning mode about modern places. So they might consider the orchard that surrounds Gropius as a source of heirloom apple varieties, have to preserve the heirloom varieties. But for Gropius, that orchard was just a bucolic New England backdrop for his modern house design. He didn't really care about the apples per se. So when I was working with Historic New England, we didn't have answers to all these issues. And I bet they're still working on the same challenges today. Gropius isn't a perfect example of a successful house museum. Instead, I think it raises good questions about how house museums really balance continuity and change. Modern 20th century materials were innovative and experimental. Design techniques were intended to disrupt the status quo. And so the preservation of modern buildings is also a rather entrepreneurial activity that adds an important dimension to the importance of a museum like Gropius House. Not only is it reflecting the significant stories of the past that brought us to where we are today, it is also providing inspiration and a creative lens for how we can move forward into the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. Peyton, you're up.
Thanks. Thanks for attending, and thanks to my colleagues. Everyone is supporting the Schindler House. This case study is Grauman's Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, Los Angeles. Finished in 1922, the same year that Schindler's King's Roadhouse was completed in what is now West Hollywood. It's a very dearly beloved building, and if you didn't know, a very significant one in cinema history. 5 years later, Sid Grauman built the Chinese Theater, and among his entrepreneurial ideas was to have movie stars step into wet cement and leave their footprints. Here, he invented the red carpet. This forecourt is where the procession with Klieg lights started in 1922. Now, we love this building, but it has to change because of earthquakes and lots of technical reasons if it's going to be an effective commercial movie palace. Next. The original proscenium was a lot of plaster with decorative paint. You can see that the projection screen was relatively small and of a very different aspect ratio than we have today. Next. And looking back over the orchestra pit at the rear of the auditorium, there were boxes, but no balcony. There is a panel in the middle, and you can just barely make out the projection ports where the projection screen was located. Next. By 1994, this is the sort of change we see. At the street, you can no longer see the forecourt because there's a massive marquee outlined in neon, but this is presence on Hollywood Boulevard. if you think back to 1922, there was essentially no marquee, just a couple of poster cases. So this is what works for a commercial cinema. Next. Below the proscenium arch, the proscenium had been removed because what works for the movie business is new technology, bigger screens, wider screens, new projections technology, and lots of options that change from year to year. Next. Looking back to the rear, you can see that there's some debris on the floor from the Northridge earthquake. The good news is that most of the damage was really serious, but was on the outside, and there needed to be major structural upgrades. In the rear center, there's a later projection booth that was built below, and there's a hole where the projection booth was for air handling equipment. Next. It's at this point, which was really dire, that the American Cinematheque bought the building from the city of Los Angeles for $1. It was one of those, here, would you please take our building situations. I spent about $14 million to restore the forecourt, to do a lot of structural work. And next, please. Yes, this is the same auditorium. Its ceiling and walls are restored, and there are reversible additions. That blue thing with the tube on top is one of the armatures that includes shoji screen-like acoustical panels, so you could adjust the acoustical environment from silent film to electric speakers. And it also carries air, feature lighting, and speakers. Next. Looking to the rear, the projection screen, rather the projection room in the rear center is back up above, raised, so it could be above the added balcony. And that is also a reversible addition that's supported only from the floor. Next. Only 25 years later, Netflix, in association with the Cinematheque, spent $70 million, just completed in October, to have a screening events location for their productions while providing a very excellent venue for the American Cinematheque to continue to present cinema and great programs. Here, the Cinematheque's marquee, which had been selected from one of many marquees over the years, was removed, and the blade sign is restored. Next. And the additions by Hodgetts and Fung from 1998 were removed so that the intact walls and ceiling are now opened up again, and the spatial experience of being in the auditorium is much more like it was in 1922. And next, please. And to end, here is that space, and looking towards the rear, you can see that there's a projection booth that is more like its original location. And what you can't see is that below that is a control room added for recording and controlling live presentations in the auditorium and for streaming. So that is very much an adaptation, of course, to Netflix, but also to 21st century presentations. And if you'll look up towards the ceiling, those black boxes are speakers hung from catenaries. So it's again a technical addition that tries to be as small as it can and be very reversible and adaptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Peyton. All right, David, you're next.
Okay, we can go right in. First slide, please. I'm going to talk about the idea of change in continuity in regard to a very famous building by Louis Kahn at the University of Pennsylvania. This is the Richards Laboratories, which was designed and constructed between 1957 and 1962. It was a later wing called the Goddard Building, which went through to 1965. But we're going to be talking really about the work we did on the Richards Building. And the Richards Building was heralded by Vincent Scully when it was complete, or even just before it was complete, which is significant. as being perhaps the greatest building of the second half of the 20th century. Of course, this was only 1960, but nonetheless, he was very excited about this building. He thought that this was the essence of where architecture was, and there was no better expression of architecture at its greatest right now. Next, please. There was a fundamental, however, discord with that between the view of Scully and the view of the architectural community and the scientists tasked with using these laboratories, who unfortunately Kahn never really got to interact with in the process of designing this building. So what happened? So Kahn had this idea. You can see it up the quote there on the left: "No space you can devise, etc." About, he basically looked at laboratories as being like architecture studios, big, wide open spaces that you could see across these broad floors and sort of understand what people around you are doing. And the whole notion of these big corner windows and the way in which these pavilions A, B, and D pinwheel around the C tower, which is the solid brick tower that was used for technical resources and mechanical equipment, never really came to fruition because it became packed with equipment right away. And even Vincent Scully had to admit that in a material sense, they function not perfectly at all. So what we were tasked with was taking a building which was lionized, it's a National Historic Landmark, by the cultural community and loathed by the scientists. So we had to come up with a way to fix that. Next, please. And just to emphasize that point, there you see Lou Kahn with a model of his building. It had not only a one-man, but a one-building show at the Museum of Modern Art. But look at the date, 1961. It's before it actually opened. And then Richards in 2011, when I began working on this building, and all of the violations of the principles of his design that are embodied in this, and the fact that it just was something that wasn't functioning well at all. Next, please. However, even on the inside, Kahn had very strict rules about how to run systems, how to build partitions, how high doors had to be, very important datum lines that had to be respected. And so we very early on, we documented this. We did a very thorough feasibility study and built into that then design and preservation guidelines to go along with this and whatever future renovations will be done to the building. But you see back to the corner of those two large pieces of glass, and the idea that space between the sill and the head of that is inviolate for anything to cross it. But figuring ways to make this work, it both made it more challenging to design, but it also in some ways made our job easier because we absolutely knew which rules we could break and which rules we really had to adhere to in order to make this work. Next, please. So the kind of adaptive solutions that we came up with, first of all, is the most fundamental is the change in program. We got rid of the wet labs, which means all of a sudden you don't have chemicals, you don't have noxious air. You can downsize your HVAC system somewhat and turn it into a center for cognitive neuroscience, which means computation. We had to do that. We also, we were very aggressive with the heating system, changing it to a chill beam HVAC. We redid the glazing, keeping the existing frames and keeping the appearance, but going with a high performance laminated glass to make them both safer and more energy efficient, and because they were breaking regularly. And then we set up a whole new, for the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, we set up a whole new partitioning system with a kit of parts, an interior kit of parts, based loosely on Kahn models, but something that would provide not only greater functionality, but frankly, greater equity, because the people with the corner offices had huge offices and everybody else had tiny offices. And we found a way to manipulate the partitioning system in order to equalize that without affecting the effect of the great windows from the outside. You can't see that the partitions are there behind. Next, please. And so here's a page from the design guidelines showing how things stack and section. And then over on the left, it's just one small example of this incredibly elegant cruciform corner detail that Kahn used, and how our system updated it. And there's a little bit of untruth in this, in the sense that those metal stops that you still see on the inside no longer are large enough to have a structural function. So it actually is a structural silicon glazed system, but it looks virtually identical to what was there before. Next. And as we thought about the fit out, we wanted to make sure that we understood the precedents in Kahn's own work for material palette, but also for this idea of being able to move the partitions off of the line of structure. And here you see, I found this very clever at the Kimball Art Museum, where he actually uses these heavy bent metal steel frames to push the walls apart and actually to create a third line of spaces within the line of the structure, really. And we use that next to, if you look over on the right, you can see the line of lights, and the line of lights on the left-hand side over the wood panels. Those are actually partitions moved off the structural grid, so that, again, we can equalize the office sizes and create a large enough space in the middle so that we could put in workstations. And there you see on the left a design for that re-entrant double glazed corner, so that the office that used to be the small office with no window now can borrow light from the big window. Next, please. We fortunately had to do little in terms of restoring the concrete on the inside. The exterior is a different matter, but I'm not going to get to that today. But basically a couple of applications of simple green for the most part, except where we had to remove paint. And it really, it warmed up the space incredibly, and it really made you appreciate not only the Kahn's use of concrete, but the varieties of it, from cinder block, and these were real 8x8 cinder blocks, the plywood formed walls, and of course the board formed walls, and the hierarchy that implies, with the board form being sort of for the more gracious spacious. We also were able to create found space in these areas for lounges where there used to be storage closets, and introduce this shroud with lighting and air distribution to conceal the new mechanical equipment above. And that's based on a Kahn sketch. So that's an idea of taking a notion and turning it into an architectural detail where it served our purpose. Next. One of the things that Kahn was intent upon, as I mentioned, is these views across from tower to tower, both inside and outside. And that was something that you were never able to do because the labs were at the end of little corridors in the original scheme. We were able to open all that up, and for the first time now be able to actually see from one space into another. So these are sort of bonuses to being able to kind of liberate the space in the way that Kahn probably would have wanted it. Next, please. And there is that same image I showed you, but now filled with workstations. And the reminder looking back at that same corner, and part of the design guidelines mandate that on every floor in every one of these bays, you have to leave one corner open to be able to continue this tradition. And I show the detail on the lower left because of the kind of obsessiveness of aligning data, which is the fact that the doors have jamb pieces, but the head is just the concrete overhead. There is no door frame at the top, just a little stop, which you could perhaps see in the detail there. And we kept that same spirit in designing the interior partition system. You can see that our doors and our panels come right up to the underside of the structure. Next, please. And it has now a beloved building. We were greatly relieved when the new tenants moved in and immediately proclaimed that it answers their needs. And it goes to show you that sometimes you have to swallow hard and just say, there are certain things we just have to clear out and really and change, but change in a way that hopefully continues some of the basic generative ideas of the building and lets it shine. And fortunately, we did not have to do anything to the exterior that changed its appearance. Okay, next, please. I'm only going to show one slide of this. This is Louis Kahn's Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad in India, a project he started on in the early 60s, and he worked on it until his death. In fact, he died in Pennsylvania Station on his way back to India on what would, of course, be his last trip to visit this. But it is presenting one of the world's great preservation problems today because of the quality of the materials, the brick itself, and also the fact of the relatively late and sort of gradual introduction of steel reinforcement for seismic reinforcing. The seismic codes actually changed early on in the process of designing this building, and I don't know all the details there. I'm learning, but there was suffice to say that after much discussion and many different options being studied, they decided to use mild steel reinforcement for reasons of economy and expediency because they were things that the workers were familiar with, but didn't really take into account the porosity of the brick and the mortar joints and the fact that that steel was going to get wet. And when it gets wet, of course, it expands. And what you see on this arch here is something that you find all over this complex. So the question is, what do you do with something like that? And people, a number of very, very thoughtful and very talented people have put their minds to this in recent years. It's not resolved. There are politics involved as well, but it is simply something to make you aware of, because if you're thinking about how to save a building and sort of advocacy on an international scale, this is certainly something where everything should be done to do the right thing, even if that ends up in the end having to be taking it down and reconstructing it, because these are buildings that are of such majesty and quality that it would be it would be awful to lose that cultural legacy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, David. All right, we're moving on to Gunny Harboe, and this is the last case study before we get to discussion.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. I wanted to share with you a project that we've been working on for almost 5 years. It's a simple little Carnegie library, a beautiful little Carnegie library up in Waukegan, Illinois, and it was built in 1903. As you see here, Patton and Miller were the original architects. It's a little neoclassical gem. What you can't tell from this photograph is that the building actually cascades back down a very steep slope. And so it has a very unusual series of, there's actually 5 levels, but they don't all align on every floor. Anyway, you can get a sense of what this building looked like. It's very much like many others built across the US in the early part of the 20th century. Next. These are some interior shots. Again, it's a typical little library, reading rooms. There are fireplaces in the 2 main reading rooms. You can see here with very elaborate mantelpieces and bookshelves and so on. And what you can't tell here is the coloration, which was quite beautiful and dramatic, which we'll get to in a minute. Next. Here you see what the condition of it was when we started. Now, the building was built in 1903, and in the 1960s, early 1960s, Waukegan built a brand new library, and therefore this one was obsolete. And thankfully, they didn't tear it down, but they just sort of abandoned it, and it remained empty for 60 years, totally empty, except for, of course, using it for random storage, like all these bicycles, and it had a bunch of building fragments from some important buildings that were demolished in town that they saved some parts of, and basically just became sort of a storage barn. The roof leaked, had terrible water infiltration problems and so on, and it was really a mess. And then the Waukegan Historical Society got the idea that they wanted to try to get the building and to turn it into a resource center for themselves, which would include a state-of-the-art archive storage facility and also some teaching elements that they were lacking in their other facilities. So next. And here you see the difference between the original reading room on the left, which was the children's reading room, and how it looked when we started after the cleanup. And you can get a sense of the red panel there. There was actually a big mural that covered that wall, but that's the original wall color. And this is also a space where the science fiction author Ray Bradbury spent a lot of time in his youth. He wrote a number of books that talked about his early childhood in Waukegan, including Something Wicked This Way Comes, which features a very dramatic ending of the story. And this part of it takes place in this library. And he often talked very fondly about it. And he left his collection of books to Waukegan, the Waukegan Public Library, and they are now turning that collection over to the Historical Society, and they are going to create sort of an homage to Bradbury in this space with his entire collection of his library, so that people that want to come and study him can do so in this space. Next. I should also say, as far as the preservation, saving the building was a big deal. It was sitting there for a very long time. As I mentioned, the city owned it, and they never did anything to it. It was never truly threatened with being demolished. It was put on the National Register, and they just couldn't figure out what to do with it or how to raise money to do something with it. And finally, this idea came forward from the Historical Society that they would work together with the Waukegan Park District, who actually acquired the building from the city, because they're separate entities, and then the Historical Society is the tenant, and so that's how they were able to figure out a way to save this building. Here's a shot of it in the 1930s, probably in that period when Ray Bradbury would run up and down those stairs. Next. Here's what the inside looked like when we got to the building and did our analysis and so on, which we did in depth and thoroughly, as we always do, including a very significant paint analysis that was actually done by BCA out of their Philadelphia office. Next. They hired us to do a historic structure report, which is one of the main planning tools that we all use in our work. And we did a very thorough investigation, as I said, of understanding the building, how it came to be, what kind of shape it's in now, and what were the possibilities for the future. Next. This is what it looked like in 2018 when we started the project. So the HSR led to a fundraising campaign to raise the money to renovate the building and to put on a small addition where they would be able to accommodate new toilet rooms and an elevator, because there was no way to get people up and down inside this multi-layered, multi-level building. And you can see that that beautiful front staircase had been torn off and replaced with a big concrete pile there, and as well as some of the other unfortunate changes, but more or less the building was the same building from the outside. Next. This was taken literally about a week ago. We are getting very close to the end. Basically, the outside is just totally restored. The original windows from the two facades here are been carefully restored. You can see the small addition to the side, which will really just serve as the accessible entrance. The main entrance in the front from the corner will remain main way people go in and out. And that, of course, is being fully restored back to what it once was. Next. Inside, as I mentioned, with the coloration here, you can see how dramatic it is. We did this thorough analysis. We found the original sand float plaster with these beautiful washes. These are rather dense washes. We did a lot of work on this kind of treatment when we restored Unity Temple and Roby House. And this is a similar related kind of a finish. It's a little bit different in some ways, but anyway, it's a very rich color that has a lot of visual texture to it. Next. So and we're looking for that to be done in a few weeks. It should be done in early June. Then they're going to have their exhibit installer come. They have a very elaborate interactive exhibitry that's going to fill most of the building, except those two key rooms that are being restored more as sort of library spaces. So the continuity is the fact that it's still used sort of as a library function. It actually has one space that is a library room. Certainly used for educational purposes like a library is. And the adaptation is to make it into something for the 21st century where they're going to have all this interactive learning ability for the children of Waukegan. My last thing I wanted to mention, as David talked about the IIMA in Ahmedabad, this is the State of Illinois building in Chicago, one of Helmut Jahn's greatest works. Some people hate it, some people love it. I'm one of the ones that loved it. It is a really important sort of techno postmodern building from 1985 next. Inside, it's just fabulous with this interior elevator that runs up. The wild color scheme, the salmon and the blue, again, some people hated it, some people loved it. But it was really sort of emblematic of its time, and it was a fabulous space. And this was a very public building. It was the State of Illinois building. This is where you went to get your driver's license and other public records. There was a food court down in the bottom of the hole there. Lots of people in this part of the loop used to love to go and use. The building has now been sold. The state of Illinois couldn't wait to get rid of it. It has a long storied history of how it didn't function. That was due to value engineering. Instead of having triple glazing, which it was designed for, it had single glazing. The mechanical system never worked, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it doesn't change the fact that it was a fabulous architectural statement, and those technical issues certainly could be fixed. Unfortunately, it was sold to a developer. The good news is he didn't tear it down, which was a real threat. The bad news is, next, this is what is the plan for it. And yes, they've saved the building, but in my opinion, it's not the same building. And this building should have been landmarked. The big problem here is that when there's no political will to do what is really required of the city of Chicago, there's a city ordinance. They are required to review and find the buildings that are supposed to be landmarked, and they're supposed to landmark them. This building qualifies. There's 7 criteria. It probably meets at least 4 for sure, probably 5, maybe even 6 of the criteria. It only needs 2, and they didn't do it. So the building is going to be transformed way beyond recognition of what it once was. It's also becoming going from a public building to a private building, and it just isn't the same at all. And I think we've lost a huge, important piece of architecture in the city of Chicago. Next. That's it, really. That's what it has always looked like, and it doesn't. They're already taking it apart, so it's the road to change is unstoppable, shall we say. Next. The end, okay. I should say. The end.
All right. Thank you, Gunny. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing now so that you can all see everybody up for this discussion. And so thanks for sharing your case studies. I think certainly a lot to dig into there. And I think there's a variety of really complex issues that we could talk at length about, but I think we'll try and give a gist of it for this discussion. So I think to start with, I'd like to sort of go back to basics on historic preservation and try and talk about not necessarily specifically with the projects that you've presented, but generally, what makes a place historically significant, and why do we care? Why do we want to save these places? What's important about them, and why is it important?
Is that open to anybody?
That's open to anybody.
So, I mean, as I just mentioned with the State of Illinois building, there have been developed since the 60s with the Venice Charter, basically, where there were some people that got together and sort of created a set of guidelines or rules about how to think about historic properties. And those have served us quite well for a long time. But over the course of the last few decades, that has morphed from being mostly focused on architecture as sort of a high art and as the main driver for much of what we consider historic preservation, and also historic actions, like the whole idea of old dead white men that had something to do with the revolution. We wanted to protect those places. That was early preservation, save those things. Now it's much more about people understanding, how we got to where we are, and that these things are markers for us that help explain the course of history, how our attitudes about architecture and our culture in general have changed, and that each one of these time periods, sort of an evolution of how this thing has happened, is important. And the best of those things really needs to be recognized and hopefully kept and celebrated. That's basically what preservation tries to do. And it's morphed now into something that's more values-based. So there's a lot of other layers you can put on it. Colleen was speaking about that as well, the Gropius House, all the different ways that the Gropius House is seen as being important. And every building has its own story, and it's important to figure out what is that story and how to get people engaged with supporting that.
And how that also extends into the context, the importance of context, whether it's an urban realm or rural or something in the middle, and how one basically getting away from a sort of monument-focused approach, regardless of what it is on the monument that you are that you may be honoring and preserving it, but just to take more of the context, and of course. And along with that is really the importance of landscapes as well, and how that works.
Yeah, so I think an interesting follow-up to that might be something might be important to a specific person for a variety of reasons. Let's say they have an interest in architecture, or they have an interest in agriculture, and the place that they're interested in, it embodies those values. But somebody else might might not find that place valuable, or might find a different place valuable for a different set of reasons. I think, the Gropius House is a great example of that, where there's a whole lot that you can dive into, whether it's modern architecture or, fusing sort of European and American traditions of building or history. There's a relationship to larger historical narratives of World War II and immigration and things like that. So there's definitely a variety of topics there. I think, we sort of touched on this a little bit, but I think it's worth noting a little more specifically is if we sort of understand why these places are important to save, what's the potential detriment of not acting, of losing these places? What do we lose as a culture?
We lose. Colleen, when you get, I just saw you on mute. Go ahead.
I think you lose that connection to place and time, and it's a little challenging because all of our communities are constantly changing. There's a constant dynamic change, but there's still something you can come back to. It's not everything can be a museum, not everything can be saved, but if we are able to save some of these touchstones, even if it's an unnamed person, it's just a wonderful building in a close to its original setting. It becomes a landmark within the community that they can always kind of go back to. And that's, I mean, sometimes you want these dynamic changes in your community, but at the same time you want some stability, some home, a place that you can continue to go back to and be kind of that steady rock for yourself.
I mean, it's so hard for us because we're all insider nerds to talk about it, I think. But I mean, it's for me, and I think for everybody else on the panel, it's a personal thing, and that you get it. You love history. You want to understand history. The physical fabric of these buildings is really something that sets the context, as David said. And it tells you something that you can't get out of a book. You can't get it out of a photograph. If you walk the streets of beautiful historic cities, you get exactly what it is, whether that's Broadway in LA or Broadway in New York. I mean, those places have parts of the past that speak to you directly, physically. And even if you're not an architecture nerd, you still pick up on that. And that's what you lose when you take those things away. You lose that sense of connection.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I think they're a reference point for understanding how places have changed. Not to say that they're always intended to stop change, but even just as a way to, they're a benchmark, I guess is the word I'm looking for how you can understand the way things around it have changed, because they are themselves a measuring stick, both in time, place, material, style, all sorts of things like that. So, let's say someone wants to save a historic building. What kinds of tools are available? I know some of you mentioned things about fundraising and community advocacy and things like that, but maybe you could expand a little bit on how some people might be able to enact tools or implement tools.
I think you start with education. You start with getting an information campaign out there, because if you can tell a good story about a building, it's amazing how many people you can win over. And I know I'm certainly, I can be won over by a good story about a building, even one I might not have initially seen a whole lot of value in. And I think that both in the larger sort of educate the public idea, but even on an individual basis, just getting those stories out there, getting the narratives. I mean, that of course is, that's a place like historic New England stock and trade, but it's kind of the standing point, and then all of the campaigns one does in some ways go off of that.
I think you're alluding to economic support in some sense. And don't forget about the really amazing incentives there are for historic preservation. We have a federal historic tax credit. Many states have state tax credits that piggyback on that give you a substantial write-off on total rehab cost. In California, we have what's called a Mills Act, which is a property tax abatement program that's adapted by many municipalities. And there's also a federal conservation easement program that can lead to a reappraisal. And if you do all three, I call that a hat trick. And if you have really smart lawyers and accountants, as they did at the Wallace Annenberg Center, you can take a piece of public property operated by a nonprofit and figure out how to get someone who needs tax credits to take that tax credit and give you the money. So there's some real cash in your pocket ways of supporting this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a program that started decades ago, and we have to we take it for granted now, but we can't, especially in the divisive political world that we live in, that those things could disappear. But in the past, anyway, there's government entities have seen the true value, the cultural value to society to save these things, to make them new again, and to find a better way to utilize them. And that's what the tax credits are for, so you can pay for the extra cost that it often takes to do these things. Let's hope everybody can do their own part to support that through their government elected representatives.
Fortunately, fingers crossed, this continues. The last major tax reform act in Congress preserved the tax credit. And it was threatened because why don't we take that money back or use it for something else? But Gunny's right, that could change tomorrow.
Should also point out that there are some kind of institutions, like most of the work that I've done throughout my career has been either for government or institutions like higher ed institutions And they aren't eligible by and large for the tax credits. They have other means of garnering support through donors and things like that. But the tax credits are primarily there as an engine for different kinds of commercial development. It's not to take anything away from them. It's just to say that you can't apply that to every building.
That's why I said to my amazement that the Wallace-Annenberg Center got tax credit money for a city-owned property with a non-tax-paying nonprofit occupant.
Really, that may
So-
be a California phenomenon. I don't know.
That is not a California phenomenon. I brought it up just so that I want to inspire people to say, this can be done. It's a federal tax law, and the federal government includes all the states. So this is the first time I've ever disagreed with David, but I want everybody to benefit from these incentives.
Oh, no, I'm not, I'm not trying to denigrate that in any way or question it. The only thing is, I do know that I've worked on plenty of projects with very smart development groups within institutions with their lawyers and accountants and everybody else. And there are certain things they just can't. I mean, they're not eligible for tax credits. There are other incentives. There are other things out there, especially now in the realm of energy and things like that. So there are many avenues available. That's true.
That's a good lead in. I'm going to take your cue on energy retrofits there, David. I think just to shift focus a little bit into adaptive reuse, because I think one of the things to acknowledge is that even a historic house museum is a form of adaptive reuse. It's not an active residence anymore. So I'd like to dive into the topic of adaptive reuse a little bit and identify sort of what it is. I think sometimes it can be a little bit of a scary term. It doesn't necessarily mean all the things you think it means at all times. There are minor adaptations that you can make and minor reuses that you can make. So it doesn't have to be a huge overhaul thing. But I know, David, you talked a little bit about adaptive reuse on the Richards Medical Labs, Gunny, at the Waukegan Library. That's another good example. But I think if we could talk a little bit about managing expectations of what can and can't be done, I think that would be really helpful. Are there?
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, and are there things, questions to pose to people who are decision makers or who needs to be involved in those kinds of decision making processes?
I think
go ahead, David. Go ahead. Well, I just was going to say, I mean, the main driver is what is the use? So what's the program? If you're going to change the use, you have to have a program that works. And I think the key is that you have to figure out what are the things about the building that are the most important. How is the building telling its story about whatever it is? For example, the building behind me, the Waukegan Library, is a library. It has this, Ray Bradbury story. It was just a place where people gathered for decades and enjoyed. So how do you identify what those things are, and how do you find a way to retain those things as fully as you can while allowing for other things to happen inside? And I don't know, in my 30 plus years of doing this, I've never found that to be impossible to do. That is sometimes the challenge, and there's a lot of design in it. A lot of architects don't like preservation because they don't think there's design in it, but there's a huge amount of design in solving that problem. How do you get it to work for a new use? And I find it's always achievable. So
that fair enough. But I also want to point out that it's something we all need to come to terms with. And I mean, I would say many of the projects I've done have also been adaptive reuse projects, including the Richards Labs. That's probably the most high profile. But this is something that if you look at the world out there and what's happening, especially in the name of sustainability, there's much more pressure in general to save existing buildings, whether they're historic or not. But they are not. But the interest is not so much to make them historic resources, but it's to reuse all of that embodied carbon and this and that. So it's kind of opening up the field of adaptive reuse to an awful lot more interested people. And I say this as someone who teaches preservation in a school that doesn't have a preservation school, but I get lots and lots and lots of students who are very interested in adaptive reuse, and a lot of studios being run that take all manner of buildings, some quite historic actually, and rethink them. So I think these are, coming to grips with that and instilling a preservation ethos into those kinds of projects to maximize the best of what's there, it becomes very important.
This is Peyton. I'd like to add and very much agree with David to say that there's a great new publication, very newly published by AIA on reuse. The primary author is Z. Smith, and it's very smart. It's very research based, and there's some great case studies there. And then to go to another of our architect heroes, Carl Elefante, the same fellow who coined the phrase the greenest building is the one that's already built, has also told us that we cannot build ourselves out of this problem. Whether it's historic or non-historic, reuse is the only answer. We have a whole building stock that we can and must deal with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think I'm just, folks who are still listening, please send in your questions. I'll be sure to ask the panel here.
Couple questions here.
Yeah. Greg. So one of them that I think is a good question based on our discussion here, especially related to house museums. There are a lot of times collections in those house museums that help tell the story of the house, tell the story of the inhabitants and the changes that have happened there over time. Are there provisions or techniques to use to manage environmental conditions for those collections? And how do you go about managing those required changes to preserve both the characteristic elements of the house, but also provide whatever the collections might require by way of conditioning?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge because usually the conditions that a building likes to survive in are not necessarily the same conditions that objects like to survive in. And so there can sometimes be a very natural conflict there. I know I've worked with some house museums where they're just sealed up completely. There's no circulation at all. So the objects just start to sort of melt in place, as it were, because there's no circulation. You don't want dust, you won't want dirt, you don't want bugs, you don't want anything. But a lot of these objects, especially in most of the building stock that I work with, which is 18th and 19th century stock, those objects survive just fine without, high-end climate controls. And when museums start to try to manage things that everything has to be 50% humidity, it doesn't always work as well as you would think it worked. I've seen situations where wallpaper will just peel off the walls because it's not getting the environmental conditions that was kind of born and raised in, if you will. And so it's a little bit of a challenge. And I think museums are really trying, especially in the house area, really trying to work with. And the collections people, they want their objects in the climate controlled special museum places. And so we end up not really having the right objects in the houses sometimes. So it is a challenge. It will always be a challenge.
A lot of times it depends on what is the object. I think you were getting at that. I mean, we know that photographs and paper objects and things like that are very sensitive to fluctuations in humidity, but most objects that would be in a house museum are the objects that people had when they were living in the house. So if you can keep an environment that's comfortable for a person, generally the furniture and the other stuff that's in the house will be just fine. It's really that over humidification issue that becomes a problem, and that has to do with changes that were made in the museum world, 30 years ago that haven't caught up to what really it ought to be today. The building that we're doing the Waukegan thing, they have a paper archive. It's very important to them. It has photographs and everything else. We created like a thermos bottle, a box inside a box in the lower level, doesn't need any windows. It's very controlled with humidity and temperature. And that's where all that stuff goes. But the rest of the building is just a normal level of heating and cooling, and everything should be fine.
So would you think it's fair to say that half the battle is managing our expectations about what do you really need to prioritize keeping in a collections facility, and then what is acceptable to leave in normal thermal and humidity conditions?
Yeah, I mean, if you got a Picasso, you might not want to have it in the house, but that may be other issues for that too, like theft or whatever.
I was going to say the security, the overall security of the building, the whether it's got fire risk, anything like that. That's almost more of a concern. I'd want to lock that up before worrying about being very finite and pristine on my environmental controls.
I mean, I another anecdote, and I'll shut up, but it blew me away in the times I've been to Europe, where you go into a 16th century building, okay? Doesn't have air conditioning, it doesn't have anything, whether it's in Italy or Spain, but I've experienced it in both places. They have priceless paintings on the wall from that period they've been hanging on that wall for centuries. They have the window open, it's hot outside, or it's cold outside, or whatever it is. There's no controls over that. You have to maintain them. So there's occasionally every 30, 40 years, you got to do some conservation work on the painting. That's what you do. That's my attitude anyway. So I think if you keep it comfortable for people, most things will be okay.
All right, I'm going to ask another question from one of our attendees. What guides the determination about the eras that you bring a site back to or restore it to, either its initial completion or if you factor in layers of subsequent history that maybe came after its initial completion? So how do you determine that, and then how do you reconcile those things if they inherently conflict?
Yeah, that yet another challenge. Everything in preservation it depends. Quite frankly, you've got to figure out and decide what your period of interpretation is, and often that is you're setting that period of interpretation to a point where you can't change the anachronistic things that don't fit in with the desired period. We have this whole addition on this house that came in 1927. We want to interpret to 1840. What do? Don't tear the addition off. So maybe you talk about a family's evolving needs over that 80-year period, and maybe that's how you address it. And so maybe you treat the front end of the house in its 1840 period, and then the rear L, you talk about the evolution of the change. You just kind of have to fit in with what makes sense to the story you want to tell and what's available to you.
Yeah, it's I have to admit that this is one thing about preservation I've never been comfortable with, is this idea of picking a period for interpretation of significance, because significance changes. It morphs with the building over time. And while I understand why it's done, I think for most living buildings that are not museums, you've got to kind of roll with it and say, okay, we want to make sure that there's a certain essence about this building as it was originally, and probably if there were significant additions or alterations made, you want to include that as well. But then you've got to upon that, have an armature to be able to change it where it's required. And I just think people get overly hung up on it sometimes, and it's almost like you got to take a deep breath and relax and just say this is a living thing that has changed throughout its life and will continue to change, and how do we best manage that without losing the essence of what was there?
That's why I think that this evolution and more emphasis on a values-based assessment of why something is important really has made a big change in how many of us think about what we're doing. Previously, the significance was based on the National Register criteria, which are rather rigid, and the interpretation about what you can and can't do in a building that's getting funding, tax credits or whatever by some regulator. They look at that and they interpret it through the lens of the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, and that's very rigid. If you have a values-based assessment and you understand that the building has a lot of different things that are playing a role, like was explained with the Gropius house and every other project any of us have worked on to greater or lesser degrees, you can figure out what's important. Not only that, but you got to say, who is it important to? So identifying the stakeholders and seeing who has, you know, something to say and think about it. What does it mean to the guy on the street? What does it mean to, you know, different groups that might have something to say about it and help take care of it? Because ultimately, if people don't care about it, it won't get taken care of.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And I think, you know, another one of our attendees' questions has to do with, you know, helping to convince people who maybe are not heritage friendly. How do you reconcile, you know, your understanding of history and architecture and built fabric with a place and maybe a infrastructure of government and financing and development that is maybe not so friendly to historic places or historic buildings?
I read that question, and you know, one track, and this is not easy, and it's not what I do, but none of this is easy. It's what we want and need. And I was going to use the city of Sacramento as an example, not because it's where a state government is seated, but it's a substantial municipality. It was not known to be a preservation-friendly town at the political level. But that changed when local activists got involved in politics. And one woman in particular not only was elected to city council, but became mayor. And over that period of change and her ability and commitment, it changed at the leadership level. And I think we all know examples of that and wish we could all do it. Let's be frankly right. I want to run the city, but I can't make myself the boss. I have to work my way up to it and to a position where I'm doing the right thing. I have good policies, but I'm also in a position to push for preservation ordinance and for an open discussion at the commission and council level when these issues arise.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you know, I think there's certainly ways to advocate for historic fabric that are not necessarily getting involved in politics. But there are all sorts of you know, different groups and advocacy organizations that exist. And I think really sending a unified message and making clear to people, to Gunny's point about why something might matter, or why something might have value to a specific person or a specific group, is a really good way to convince them why they should care.
One general question up there. I don't know if you saw that. Right.
Well,
curious about, yeah, why each one of you feel.
Oh yeah. So yeah, another question from one of our attendees about, you know, a little more generally about each of you, why you feel called to do this work, what got you interested in it, why are you here?
That's an hour in its own or more.
That might be our next conversation.
I love history. I love history. That's, for me, it was about history. and buildings were sort of the biggest repository. I loved historic house museums when I was young. I love going in there and seeing all the old stuff, and all the stuff was in the house, and the house was the place that people lived. And I could make that leap to understand what that lifestyle was like, and how it might have been to live in those times. That's meant something to me. For I guess that's the basic line for me.
Yeah, I would
And that
just say
goes back to the Iron Age for me, because I lived in an Iron Age house for a week once. Yeah, sorry.
no, I think it's I mean, I would echo very much what Gunny says. I grew up with I grew up in an academic family, but I grew up not only loving history, but loving cities and loving walking around cities and buildings. And I came to architecture and to working with historic buildings as an alternative to being simply an academic. And the first time I really encountered having to confront what to do with a historic building, I never felt so excited in my life. I never felt so challenged and just exhilarated. And that's largely stayed with me these 40, 50 years. And I'm glad to be able to still do it.
So this is Peyton again. I think it was inevitable. I always knew I wanted to be an architect. Didn't know what kind of architect I wanted to be. After undergraduate school, was living in Washington, D.C. in 1976, which was kind of a big year for a rocket's red glare of history. And I met up with the right people, but I think the inevitability was that I grew up in Virginia and I graduated from the University of Virginia, and it was just there, and someone needed to point it out to me.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I also grew up in a family where, we went to history things all the time. History museums, house museums, events, whatever. And also I was an Air Force brat, so kind of moving all over. So you experience a lot of things. And like I was hinting at earlier, you kind of need a touchstone, a place to come back to. And so starting to lean into why this place matters, and you just need something consistent that you can always go back to. And there's a challenge. There's a challenge in fixing what's old and not having to throw away things. And so that just gets bigger and bigger with the bigger buildings. So it's just another challenge for me.
I think we have time for one more question, Greg, or comment from the list. This is super interesting, and it's going really long, but I'm really glad everybody's here.
Yeah. I think if we're got one more question, I think there's a good one here about adaptive reuse again, specifically as it relates to the housing crisis. How to reconcile when the zoning code or the zoning board might not be amenable to reuse or redesign of historic structures into multifamily or commercial or office spaces, that there might be some politics involved, which I think we've discussed is perhaps a little bit inevitable. But how do you reconcile those kinds of challenges?
I would turn that on its head a little bit, having had so many good brains talking to us at the Taliesin Colloquium, to say that the challenge was to mostly architects, but also federal and state officials and local people and users and window manufacturers. It was, yes, there's a code problem and there are challenges technically, budget-wise, safety-wise, in many adaptive reuses, particularly if you're thinking about a building where people are living and sleeping. But it's that, you preservation people, you regulators, you practitioners have to, in my words, loosen up a little bit, because the way we get these really good adaptations that are safe is, and these are very much my words, meeting the code enforcement halfway to make it work, not for every building, but for many buildings.
Yeah, I mean, and we found in our work, at least we used to, that in Chicago, which has its own building code, that if you meet with the building folks and you demonstrate that you're actually making things way better than they were, you sometimes can get some relief on some things. Not safety, you got to make it safe, but it's unfair to expect an old building that has a lot of hurdles, not the least of which is money, to be able to expect it to perform exactly like you would with a new building. And I think that is changing, actually, for the better. We didn't talk about this, but sustainability issues. The LEED has been kind of this developed standard of how to evaluate whether a building is more sustainable or not. But the problem with LEED, I've always said, number one, it's a checklist. Number two, it never gave you credit for the cultural sustainability issues. I mean, you should get a lot of credit for the fact that you're allowing society and the cultural values of whatever the building is you're working on to remain. If you do things to it in order to meet the energy piece, and you've lost what the thing means or how it looked or whatever, what have you gained, really? You've lost, like that Google project. Okay, they could make that building look exactly like it did and have it perform just like they're going to, triple glazed, whatever they want. They could absolutely have done that. Probably wouldn't even have cost anything, but that's not what they're choosing to do. It's not because of the sustainability. That's a bunch of BS. It really is because they want to change the way it looks and to make it into something else.
We do find that the energy codes are in some way, I wouldn't say they're targeting preservation projects, but they're not giving as much leeway as they have in the past. They're basically throwing down a gauntlet saying, you got to rise to the occasion. Cambridge is the perfect example, because Cambridge has a very enlightened regulatory apparatus when it comes to historic preservation. Charlie Sullivan has been at this for 50 years. He gets it. He's worked with all manner of historic buildings and allowed some very robust kind of changes to a lot of very famous works. But even there, we're being pushed to do everything we can to make sustainability a priority. It's primarily meeting envelope criteria for U value. So it's just, and I think, and a lot of people in this area are sort of saying, okay, we got to do it, we'll do it. And I think in some ways they anticipated that, but it's going to be a continuing challenge, certainly.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you all. And Ann, I'm going to hand it back to you.
I just want to say thank you, everybody. This was fascinating, really great group of people with amazing stories and buildings to share and work, and inspiring too for Schindler House and for everybody who was on this call. I think we need to do it again. Part 2, whenever that is. But fantastic, and thank you all for joining us. Yeah, stay tuned for the next Schindler Talk. Leslie, anything?
Just echoing that from the board, and to say that this was a really, really wonderful way to prepare us, and I'm looking at you, Peyton Hall, for our next Schindler Talk in July, in which we'll kind of take this broad conversation and dive into how the conservation management plan for the Schindler House is being developed. We're incredibly excited about that, and we're really looking forward to using the Schindler House as the centerpiece of a conversation. We'll be coming back to this theme over the next year, and I'm sure beyond, as we learn through the CMP process at the Schindler House, and issues that everyone brought up today will come bubbling back. So we're excited. We're excited to learn with you. I would not be doing my job if I did not remind you that a building like this and a process like this needs fundraising. And so as you are thinking about what you'll be doing in Q3 and Q4, we hope you'll remember us. And thank you so very much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank
great
you.
night.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
everyone.
you for including us.
Yes, it's been a privilege. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.